Tonight, a big moment in the 2024 general election battle. Stay with us, as for the very first time in this campaign, Scottish party leaders go head-to-head in debate. Good evening and welcome to the STV Leaders Debate, the first big head-to-head debate of this general election. You join us live on STV, ITV Border and the STV Player. With us, the leaders of the four Scottish parties which won seats at the last Westminster contest in 2019. Now, we've heard a lot about this being a change election, and certainly all the parties here tonight have changed their leaders in the past 5 years, one of them more than once. We're going to hear from the leader of the Scottish Labour Party, Anas Sarwar, the leader of the SNP, John Swinney, the leader of the Scottish Conservatives, Douglas Ross, and the leader of the Scottish Liberal Democrats, Alex Cole-Hamilton. Tonight, we'll follow the usual STV debate format. We'll start with a general discussion before the leaders get the chance to cross-examine each other. You won't want to miss that. It'll add up to what could be the fastest 90 minutes of TV you'll see this month, and that could be up against some stiff competition with the Euros coming up. We'll get going in just a few minutes, but first, Tyrone Dougal will be watching the action with three analysts.
Thanks, Colin. After the debate, we'll be assessing this big night in politics with the community editor and columnist with the National, Shona Craven, the political editor of ITV Border, Peter McMahon, and Lucy Dunn, who writes on Scottish and UK politics for The Spectator. Well, this is very exciting. This is a big day in the election campaign. The Scottish leaders are under a lot of pressure, aren't they, Shona?
They are, and the cross-examination, as Colin says, will be of particular interest. People in Scotland really want to know what this election, a general election, means to them and what the leaders are offering in terms of those crucial reserved issues.
Yeah, and what are they going to try to achieve tonight, Peter?
First, don't mess up, I think, will be the main rule. The second thing will be get your soundbite out. I bet we hear change from Anas Sarwar and probably Alex Cole-Hamilton. Wouldn't be surprised we Westminster austerity from John Swinney, and probably SNP obsession with independence from Douglas Ross. And finally, land a blow on your opponent if you can.
Not physically, obviously.
No,
and Lucy, prime-time audience, you know, they've got to make the most of this, haven't they?
Absolutely, and as much as sound bites are important, I think a lot of voters are feeling a little bit disengaged with politics just now, and they want politicians to win back their trust, and they want to be told exactly what these politicians will be doing for them, for the day-to-day issues that affect them, and for the situations that they've faced over the last few years, post-pandemic, and with the cost-of-living crisis.
And Shona, you did mention the cross-examination format, which is really great, the no-holds-barred politics there. I love that bit.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of the politicians will be seeking to broaden out this discussion and land some blows that may or may not be relevant, really, to how the viewers vote, but will be relevant to that trust and that perception.
Yeah, very briefly, they can take that anywhere they want, that section, can't they?
They absolutely can, and you know they'll have done a lot of preparation for this, including probably mock question and answers with their staff.
Yeah, plenty of prep over the weekend, I would imagine, Lucy.
Absolutely, and I'm sure this is going to be the start of a very exciting debate tonight, but also a very long and drawn-out 6 weeks of this election campaign.
Absolutely. We will come back to you after the debate. Now, over to Colin.
Right, here we go. We start the debate by giving each leader a minute to set out their stall with opening statements.
I want the next 5 years to be all about delivering action on the issues that really matter to you. Creating good jobs, cutting tax, reducing NHS waiting lists, fixing our roads, investing in schools. We've listened and we know these are your top priorities, and that's what Scottish Conservative MPs will focus on. But in many seats across Scotland, it's a straight fight between my party and the SNP. If the SNP win, they'll claim every seat as a mandate for independence. They'll be distracted from the local issues you care about. So in key seats up and down Scotland, if everyone who wants to beat the SNP votes together for the Scottish Conservatives, we can end their obsession with independence for good. This is our chance. The SNP are down, but we need to get them out. Vote Scottish Conservative to beat the SNP and get the focus onto your priorities.
Our country is crying out for change. And after 14 years of Tory chaos and failure, this is an opportunity Scotland cannot afford to miss. I know families are struggling because of the cost of living crisis. And I know so many families are worried about loved ones who can't get treatment because of the crisis in our NHS. That's why a Labour government will deliver economic stability to bring down the cost of your mortgage. We'll end tax loopholes for the super rich so we can put more money into our NHS and cut waiting times. We'll lower bills for good by having our own energy generation company headquartered here in Scotland. And we'll tackle poverty by making work pay. Scotland can't afford 5 more years of this rotten Tory government. We can't miss this opportunity for change. So every vote for Scottish Labour is a vote to make sure we get rid of the Tories, to maximise Scotland's influence, and to deliver the change Scotland needs.
As your First Minister, I will be totally focused on the issues that matter to you. I know these debates can often turn into a bit of a shouting match, but I think the times are far too serious for that. I know that many of you are struggling with the cost of living. I know you want the very best of healthcare for you and your family. If you're in business, Brexit has made your life a lot tougher. I want to sort those issues out. I believe the best way to do that is to ensure decisions are made in Scotland for Scotland. In government, the SNP is doing everything we can to protect Scotland in these tough times. We're delivering free tuition, free prescriptions, expanding childcare, keeping 100,000 children out of poverty and 100,000 businesses out of paying rates. We all know the Westminster system is broken. It's delivered austerity, Brexit and the cost of living crisis. Scotland deserves better. I'm asking you to vote SNP to put Scotland's interests first.
There was a time when you could see your GP at the first point of asking, when our schools were world class and all the ferries worked. But over many years, ministers in London and Edinburgh have lost sight of what matters to you. You're working harder, but it feels like you're falling further behind. We badly need some hope and a change of direction. Well, Scottish Liberal Democrats are all about hope, and we're part of the change that's coming. In the next Parliament, we'll be working for a better Britain to restore your faith in politics and fix our broken relationship with Europe. We'll fight for fast access to GPs, NHS dentists and mental health services. We'll stop sewage being dumped in our rivers and fight the climate emergency. We'll deliver world-beating education and a green jobs revolution to get our economy growing again. Back the Liberal Democrats for a fair deal for you, for your family and for Scotland.
It's probably the longest I've let any of you speak without interrupting you, isn't it? But we've got a lot of big issues to get into in this election, so let's get cracking. There's a big YouGov poll out tonight looking at constituencies in Scotland across the UK. It points to a Labour majority of 194 across the UK. That would be the biggest in a century, overtaking the SNP in Scotland as well. Now, remember, it's just one poll, but it's certainly making big waves in the campaign today. Anas Sarwar, there is another poll out today, though, which suggests that voters aren't terribly enthusiastic about Sir Keir Starmer.
Well, look, you're right, polls are out and not a single vote has been cast in this general election. And this debate tonight is actually not about us, it's about the people watching this programme. And I can understand that trust in politics is at an all-time low, and I can understand people's frustration of what they feel like is managed decline. And that's why through this campaign, with hard work and humility, we will seek to earn people's trust, we'll seek to demonstrate what change will mean in practice, and we will demonstrate the difference we have.
But they're not enthusiastic about what you're demonstrating.
It'll be good if we demonstrate that we can get rid of this rotten Tory government and have a government that's on your side delivering for the Scottish people. That's economic stability to bring down the cost of people's mortgages after they went up by £2,000 on average because of Liz Truss's mini budget. It means more money for the NHS.
Absolutely, and you said all of that in your opening. You said all of that in your opening statement.
John Swinney's
said all of that in your opening statement. John Swinney, are you just managing decline, as Anas Sarwar says?
No,
this election.
Well, I'm taking the SNP into this election recognising the challenges that we face, and I'm here. I didn't expect to be here 5 weeks ago, but I'm here because the SNP's faced tough times. And I'm here to rebuild the trust of the people of Scotland in the SNP. And I think rebuilding trust begins by recognising you've got challenges to overcome, and I recognise those.
And this poll shows the scale of them.
Yeah, of course it does, and it shows that we've got a lot of work to do, which is why I'm setting out a message which is hopeful about the future of Scotland. We can see that the Westminster system is broken. It's delivered austerity, Brexit and a cost-of-living crisis, and I think Scotland deserves better than that.
But do you accept that these polls suggest you're going to lose a lot of seats in this election?
Well, Anas is absolutely right. Not a vote has been cast yet, so these are polls. But
hang on, that was just an I agree with Anas moment.
I think
early in the debate for that.
Surely there's got to be some space in this discourse, Colin, for us to recognise some of the realities. So there's polls come out. Yes, they show challenges for the SNP, and I'm focusing the SNP on building out of that
it's not
to
about
win
the
this
SNP,
election.
It's about Scotland, John.
Douglas Ross, these polls suggest that you could be facing an absolute disaster, and Nigel Farage is back to rub salt in your wounds tonight as well.
Well, what I would say, Colin, I'll start with consensus, because I think every one of us will agree that a poll is simply one poll and not a single vote has been cast. So we will all be working hard across the country to get supporters to back our parties, to do the best thing for Scotland and Scotland's place within the United Kingdom. But that poll also shows that in many of the key seats, there is a razor-thin margin between victory or defeat for the Scottish Conservatives or the SNP. There are these key seats up and down the country where a few votes will make a difference. And you mentioned Nigel Farage. A vote for reform here in Scotland will be a vote that in some seats will help the SNP win. So that's why I'm asking people, unite behind the Scottish Conservatives. Unite behind the Scottish Conservatives, beat the SNP and get the focus onto the issues that people are speaking about in this election.
Is this whole election about the SNP for you?
Well, it's about focusing on the issues that really matter to people. And the issues that matter to people are NHS waiting lists. 1 in 7 Scots on an NHS waiting list. Our educational standards...
Remember, it's a Westminster election.
Yeah, but I don't think it's up to us to say what are the priorities. It's up to people that we are speaking to up and down Scotland, and they are worried about NHS waiting lists under 17 years of the SNP. They're worried about the education of their kids and grandkids after John Swinney's time as Education Secretary and the SNP being in power for almost 2 decades.
Alex Cole-Hamilton, are you worried that you're struggling to break through according to these polls?
Not at all, not at all. There was another Redfield-Wilton poll of bigger size today, which actually had us more than doubling our share of MPs at Westminster. And we're used to confounding expectations. In the local government elections, everyone predicted the Liberal Democrats would go backwards. We outperformed every other opposition party and increased our council base by 1/3. We do that by going door by door and street by street, listening to the voters and the issues that matter to them, like getting ready access to a GP at the first time of asking, lifting Scottish education back to where it used to be, taking the sewage out of our rivers. We're having a great election. Just look at the smile on my face.
The thing that the polls all agree on is that the biggest issue in this election is the cost of living crisis. Anas Sarwar, what would Labour do about it?
So we would do a windfall tax on the oil and gas giants to make sure we're putting more money into people's pockets to lower their bills, as well as investing in the clean energy of the future so we can lower bills for good. And our new deal for working people will deliver a pay rise for over 200,000 Scots who are struggling in poverty right now. That's what we would do immediately. Building on top of that, we would have economics. How much is the windfall
tax going to raise?
It's going to raise billions of pounds of investment, around £3 billion a year, and that's going to mean more money in people's pockets to lower the bills in the short term, but it means billions of pounds of investment in that huge renewable potential we see in Scotland to create 69,000 jobs, to partner with the oil and gas industry and deliver that just transition we all want to see.
The oil and gas industry say that that very policy could cost 100,000 jobs in Scotland.
Well, look, I can understand why, after 14 years of broken promises from the Conservatives and 17 years of broken promises from the SNP, while people are sceptical about what will happen in the North East. But let me be really clear, because it's important to give this reassurance. There will be no cliff edge. There will be no turning off of the tap. Oil and gas will play a significant role for decades to come, and that's,
you're still against new developments.
And that's not just to protect the jobs right now, but it's also because if we are going to get the scale of investment we need to see in that renewables future, we need those very oil and gas companies as well as the renewable companies to make those investments, and we will do that in partnership
John
to
Swinney,
deliver that transition.
On that very issue of oil and gas, are you in favour of new licences for the North Sea?
Well, I'm in favour of a just transition to net zero, and the problem with what Anas has set out is that there is a very direct damage going to be done to the oil and gas sector as a consequence of the tax plans that he's put forward and which the Conservatives have put into place.
Which so you don't support a windfall tax?
Well, I'm in favour of windfall taxes where there are gross profits being made, but the danger of your position, Anas, is that that is going to lead to the loss of tens of thousands of jobs in the northeast of Scotland. Now that, I'm afraid, is a price that is not worth paying. That's what Mrs Thatcher did to the industrial... No, just let me answer your question.
And I'll come back on it.
And I'll set out the position, because what Mrs Thatcher did when she was in power was she created an industrial wasteland in central Scotland, and we're still picking up the pieces. Now, the danger of your stance, you're going to do exactly the same to the northeast of Scotland, and we will make the transition to net zero, but we'll do it in a fashion that works with the oil and gas sector, and a fashion that delivers energy security and makes the transition in an orderly, managed fashion.
Very briefly, because
we're going to get rid of the modern-day Thatcherites, but just to make this clear, you support higher taxes for people earning £29,000 a year in Scotland, for example, nurses, but not higher taxes on windfall taxes on the oil and gas giants making record profits. You're really on the side of BP and Shell, not nurses and working people across the country in the middle of a cost of living crisis.
I really don't think you're in a strong position to say this to me, Anas.
Higher taxes on nurses?
Well, Anas, when you're in favour of lifting the cap on bankers' bonuses, you've not got a leg to stand on.
Higher taxes for those earning £29,000 a year.
I think people on higher income should pay more into the general pot of tax. But what you've done is walked away from properly investing in public services.
Briefly, right, I want you to answer my question before I move to them. Are you in support of new licences for the North Sea?
Well, I'm in favour of working with the oil and gas sector to ensure that all of the decisions we take...
Are you in favour of new licences?
Let me finish...
But you're not answering the question. You didn't answer it the last time I asked it. Are you in favour of new licences?
Well, I want to make sure that every decision we take has got a climate compatibility test attached to it. That's the crucial issue we've got to take.
Are you in favour of new licences?
I've given you your answer, which is we've got to have a climate compatibility test on every single decision we take in relation to the oil and gas sector.
That's a no. John Swinney and the SNP are against new oil and gas licences. Just say it. Be honest, John.
Well, I'm in favour of a climate compatibility test because
so
Douglas...
you would be against... Just very quickly, because
Douglas,
if I can, just with all due respect, John.
Just let me finish the answer. What you're going to do, Douglas, is turn your back on the transition to net zero. And the journey to net zero has got to be delivered, but it's got to be delivered in a managed fashion. And the recklessness of the tax hikes that you're undertaking are undermining investment in the northeast of Scotland as we speak.
Let Douglas have a say.
So we've had about 4 minutes now. Colin's asked twice. I'm going to ask for another time. Are you personally and the SNP in favour of granting new oil and gas licences? Yes or no?
I'm in favour of there being a climate compatibility test on every single one. Well, because we've got to judge, Douglas, the right things to do in terms of the transition to net zero. And you are ignoring the reality of climate change, which is going to affect all of the communities of Scotland. We can't turn our backs on that, Douglas.
It feels like we started the cross-examination early here.
Your party's turned its back on the realities facing our country.
Hang on, Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Colin, I think what we've just seen here is an example of two parties that have been in power for far too long. And we're at this situation, nowhere near the just transition that we need, and that transition is baked into the geology of the seabed of the North Sea. And these parties have been bereft of ideas. They've not driven down reliance on fossil fuels, and they've not taken the steps to bring about that just transition. I met a guy who works on the rigs, high up on the rigs, and he can't get certificates to do high work on the wind turbines because the red tape's in the way. This is easy wins that we could have.
This is not just about North Sea oil and gas. This is about central Scotland as well. Grangemouth, for example. Very quickly, we've only got a minute. What would you do to save Grangemouth?
Well, we need to recognise the importance that represents to our economy.
What would you do to save it?
Well, I think we need to make sure that the workforce there have a viable future, and we should, if needs be, work together across the political spectrum to bring.
What would a Conservative government do to save it? Because it's not done anything so far.
Well, they are working with the Scottish government.
Yeah, but you haven't done anything so far.
Well, there has been efforts by both the Scottish and UK governments to come together.
Achieved nothing so far.
And there's also been support for the union campaign to get behind the workers there to make sure there's a viable future for Grangemouth.
John Swinney, what would you do to save Grangemouth?
I build on the steps that were already taken to engage with the management of Grangemouth and the workforce to bring them together and to work with the UK government where we can to secure the necessary route through this. Grangemouth is a vital...
You wouldn't step in and take it over or anything like that? You have done with companies before.
These are plants that operate in the private sector, and we've got to secure the private investments required to sustain its future.
We would step in and put our money where our mouth is and invest in
Would you step in to save the refinery?
We would step in to save the jobs at the refinery and to invest in that transition by making an energy transition hub at Grangemouth, and we would put hundreds of millions of pounds behind it to make it a reality, to protect those jobs and build Grangemouth for the future.
I told you this was going to be the fastest 90 minutes on television, because now it's time for the leaders to face cross-examination. 3.5 minutes of questions from each of their opponents. I will enforce a strict time limit on this and do my best to encourage a civilised exchange of views, which we've had mostly so far. First in the spotlight is Scottish Labour leader Anas Sarwar, and the first questioning comes from John Swinney.
Anas, the Institute for Fiscal Studies has said that the current spending plans, which a Labour government coming in, I think we all know there's a Labour government coming in, will inherit, involve a requirement to make £18 billion worth of spending cuts. And the Labour Party signed up to the same fiscal approach as the Conservatives. Where are the spending cuts going to come?
Well, I don't accept that there will be spending cuts. We have set out where we will raise extra revenues to both invest in our public services right now, as well as make the investments for the long term. For example, the windfall tax on the oil and gas giants that you continue to oppose, that would generate billions of pounds that would be invested here in Scotland to create more jobs and lower bills. For example, ending the non-dom tax loophole, so we tax the super rich and put more money into our NHS. That is 160,000 more appointments every year. You asked the question, John, so allow me to finish. 160,000 appointments every year to take on the NHS waiting list crisis that you have presided over, with 840,000 people, on an NHS waiting list. We will close tax loopholes to make sure we put more money, for example, into our schools, something that you have allowed to decline over the last 17 years.
The difficulty that you face...
More money.
The Institute for Fiscal Studies say that there's an £18 billion black hole in the public finances which a Labour government has got to fill. And all those different tax changes you've set out are tax changes that you've already allocated the money to spend on different priorities. So where are the spending cuts going to come? Because you're going to prolong austerity that's undermined our public services in Scotland.
Not at all, John. And you are the architect of austerity in Scotland, particularly around local government. We have already committed more money to our public services. I've already set out how we would do more capital investment. We would borrow to do capital investment as well.
You've accepted the borrowing limits.
Crucially, growing the economy, which increases the size of the cake and more money to spend.
I'm sorry,
I thought as a former finance secretary you would understand.
I understand all of that, but you've accepted the tight borrowing constraints of the Tories. You cannot say to me that you're going to borrow to invest in the economy, because that contradicts what Rachel Reeves has said.
Not at all.
You have totally rewritten the Labour financial strategy.
If you let me answer the question, we have said that we would not borrow for day-to-day spending, but we would look at borrowing in terms of making capital investment, because that's how you grow the economy. I would think, as a former finance secretary, you would understand the economics of making that happen.
All of that.
More money for the NHS, more money for the NHS, more money for our schools, more money to invest in the renewables potentials of Scotland, more money for our ports, more money for Grangemouth, more money for offshore wind, onshore wind, carbon capture and storage, our supply chains to create the jobs here in Scotland, 69,000 jobs, more money to invest in capital investment around housing when you cut investment by £200 million. This is good for Scotland, John.
You cannot escape the fact that you've signed up to the Tories' fiscal agenda and the austerity agenda. You are locked into that, and you will not be able to deliver those commitments.
John, isn't it surprising that you have said you're desperate to get rid of this Tory government, but all you've done in this election campaign is attack the Labour Party? Because isn't it the case you fear the Tories being booted out of office because you don't want a Labour government? You should be straight about the only way to get rid of this Tory government is by voting Labour in this election.
You both have to stop now just for a moment, because it's Douglas Ross's turn to ask questions of Anas Sarwar.
Thank you. Anas, why don't you support new oil and gas licences for the North Sea?
Because we have said quite clearly that there will be no cliff edge, there will be no turning off the tap. We will work with the oil and gas sector to make sure we maximise all those oil fields that have already currently been identified. But we recognise that there has to be large-scale investment if we are to fill our renewables potential. So far from having fewer jobs, our plan would create 69,000 jobs here in Scotland, 53,000 jobs backed up by GB Energy, a publicly owned energy generation company that would be headquartered here in Scotland, tasked with creating more jobs, lowering bills, delivering energy security, really important when you have despotic regimes like Russia who want to use energy as a way of holding their foot to our throat. Far from it. And we are going to demonstrate climate leadership so Scotland can finally realise its full potential. This is the plan that is good for Aberdeen, good for the North East, good for Scotland and good for the UK.
Well, as
and the
someone who lives
reason why
in the
there is so
North
much
East, I know it's
nervousness
not good
is
for the
because of
North
the
East.
broken promises of 14 years of the Conservatives and broken promises from 17 years of the SNP.
But we know Labour
plans. That's why if you want a plan that is good for those workers, if you want a plan that's going to create more jobs, if you want to tackle the cost of living crisis, then the only way we can do that is if we take this chance and take this opportunity to boot out a lying, corrupt, cheating Conservative Party that has destroyed communities across this country and now wants to pretend they're going to protect them.
Offshore energies.
People can see right through it.
Offshore Energies UK say Labour plans will cost 42,000 jobs. Are they wrong?
Well, we're working closely with Offshore Energies.
Well,
we're working closely with other oil and gas giants, and they are wrong because we believe that our plans will create 69,000 jobs here in Scotland.
But we'll lose 42,000 in the North Sea.
I don't accept that we are going to see
This is the
fewer
industry
jobs.
body
I believe we will see
that is
more
at the
jobs.
heart of oil and gas.
And you know, Douglas,
saying 42,000 jobs will
and
be
you know,
lost.
Douglas,
and you mentioned investment.
And I'll come back to answer the question, Douglas.
Offshore Energies UK also said your plan, the Labour plan, will wipe out North Sea investment. Were they right with that as well?
I disagree. And again, we will demonstrate through partnership and cooperation how we can attract investment into Scotland to make sure we realise our energy ambitions. And as I say, this is a good plan for our country. And where are the large-scale jobs?
Just on that,
and where are the large-scale jobs going to come from?
Out, so let me just come back.
You're not giving me a chance to answer the second question.
You've had quite a long time to answer, and you're not really
The large-scale
doing
jobs comes from the supply chains, because all these wind farms we see popping up across the country that demonstrate more energy, 95% of those components are built elsewhere. So they're not built here in the UK. So that's why we'll invest in the supply chains to create the jobs here. We'll invest in our ports, so we're ready for that infrastructure for the future.
Aberdeen and Grampian,
more
Chamber
bills,
of Commerce.
more jobs.
Aberdeen and Grampian, Chamber of Commerce say the Labour plans for the offshore oil and gas industry are a betrayal of the North East. They're right, aren't they?
I don't accept that.
You're not accepting anything.
Also the
These
Chamber
are the industry
Chamber of
experts
Commerce
and people at the heart of the North East who are telling you how damaging your plans are.
What I would say is the Chamber of Commerce has also said, been critical of Conservative Party plans. They've been critical of SNP
a betrayal
plans. And we have made very clear, and I want to make it directly clear to the Chamber of Commerce, that you don't I want to work directly with them, their member organisations, the trade unions, the workers, those businesses, to make sure we don't make those mistakes that your party made.
You're making
with the
those
coal mining
mistakes
industry,
now with
so
these dangerous plans for the offshore oil and gas industry in the
energy transition
North East.
Scotland can be proud of.
And the final set of questions to Anas Sarwar comes from Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Anas, at this election, Liberal Democrats are bringing forward proposals that would see hundreds of millions of pounds come north, which we would earmark for health, in particular rural healthcare. We care passionately about it. We've got a plan for the mums who have to travel 100 miles down the treacherous A9 to give birth, for the Belford Hospital in Lochaber that should have been replaced 20 years ago, and indeed for the woman on Skye who nearly died on the doorsteps of Portree Hospital because all the doors were locked. Now, you do talk a lot about health in the Scottish Parliament, to your credit, but it's almost always about what's going on in our cities. Where's Labour's plan on rural healthcare? And is it because you realise that actually in large parts of rural Scotland it's only the Lib Dems that can take on the SNP?
Well, look, there's every part of the country we're going out for Labour votes to try and get the change we need to get rid of this rotten Tory government. But you ask a really important question about healthcare. The reality is, whether you live in an urban community, a rural community or an island community, there are far too many people stuck on an NHS waiting list. 840,000 of our fellow Scots stuck on an NHS waiting list. And sadly, what's happened across the country, particularly in our rural and island communities, is services being pulled away. And that's why so many island communities and rural communities, yes, they feel distant from Westminster, but actually they feel equally distant from Holyrood as well. That's why we've got to have a proper workforce plan, something that's not happened for well over a decade. It's why we have to invest in technology so we can do faster, rapid diagnosis, particularly remotely, as well as the most innovative care. And we've got to have a plan that delivers for our rural communities, which is partly healthcare systems, but also a transport system that's fit for purpose, again, neglected by this SNP and Tory government, as well as a plan for housing, because there is still far too high rural poverty, and in particular rural fuel poverty.
I was going to ask you about the poverty, because you'd agree with me that actually for everyone stuck on an NHS waiting list, for any one of the 177,000 people who are suffering long COVID in this country, for whom the Scottish Government have done next to nothing, that is a demonstrable impact on our ability to grow the economy and to take people out of poverty. Is that part of your plan as well?
Absolutely. I think you're right, Alex, to highlight there that it's not just the human tragedy of people stuck on an NHS waiting list or suffering from long COVID and the impact that has on their physical health, their mental health, their relationships, actually also holds them back from accessing the employment market and being able to provide for their families. And that's why we've got to tackle this NHS crisis head on, a huge crisis. I would equal it, if not make it even bigger crisis, to the cost of living crisis. And that's why we need to invest in our NHS. That's why we would close the non-dom tax loopholes on the super rich to put that money into the NHS and create 160,000 appointments. And it's why we would change the NHS here in Scotland, and we get the opportunity to do that in 2026.
Can I ask you about sewage? Last year, 20,000 tonnes of raw sewage were pumped into Scotland's rivers and beaches. We're talking wet wipes, sanitary towels, even human waste. And this is all done by the Scottish government-owned water company that rewards its bosses for this failure with eye-watering bonuses. This should be a problem for all of our parties. It should be a massive issue in this election. What's Labour's plan for the national sewage crisis?
So you're right to highlight this. It's completely unacceptable, the levels of sewage being dumped into our waters. You're right to say that Scottish Water is publicly owned, so we should have higher expectations on them. They've got a huge surplus. They should be using that surplus cash to invest in having more monitoring and upgrading our water to make sure there is no sewage. And also, the bonus is completely and utterly unacceptable when you look at the state of our seas.
OK, Alex Cole-Hamilton and Anas Sarwar, thanks for finishing that, because next to field questions is the Scottish Liberal Democrat leader, Alex Cole-Hamilton, and it's he's taking questions from Anas Sarwar.
Alex, my first job was in the NHS as a dentist in Paisley, and I noticed when you launched your campaign, you talked about NHS dentistry, and we all accept that we have to fix the problems in our NHS. So I want to ask directly, do you support Labour's plans to end the tax loopholes on the super rich, in particular the non-doms, to invest in our NHS and to create 160,000 more appointments every year?
Well, that's certainly one approach to raising the money our NHS needs. Another would be to reverse the £3 or £4 billion cut to the tax on banks that Rishi Sunak has employed. But you may recall, Anas, that my family took in a Ukrainian refugee for 9 months. And one thing that really struck me about that is she had several friends from Ukraine that couldn't actually get on to an NHS dentist's books. And as such, when they needed complex care, they actually had to travel back to war-torn Kiev for the care that they needed. I mean, they took the risk of the cruise missile attacks and the drone strikes of war-torn Ukraine rather than being able to find care in our NHS. That is an indictment of the system right now. People are buying tools on Amazon and affecting the work themselves and botching the work themselves. So we do several things about dentistry. Firstly, make it easier on a UK basis for foreign qualified dentists who are here already practising as hygienists and other professions to practice dentistry on the NHS. Secondly, we want to make it easier as well, reduce tooth decay by reducing VAT. And finally, I think we can all agree that actually just making it easier to access NHS dentists for our refugee community should be a #1 priority for every party.
Well, you're making a former dentist very excited about plans for NHS dentistry, and I hope that's something we can build on. I want to ask another question about devolution. Obviously, in the early years of devolution, our two parties worked together to try and deliver for the people of Scotland and demonstrate the difference you can make when politicians are willing to put differences aside and actually work together. But isn't it the case over the last 14 years with the Conservatives at Westminster and the SNP here in Scotland that they've actually damaged devolution and focused more on picking fights with each other and ultimately failed Scotland? And isn't this an example why after this election we have to reset devolution and get back to two governments willing to work together in the national interest and deliver for the people of Scotland? We
need to reset politics, full stop. And I think the people will have seen these parties who've been in power for far too long at each other's throats, behaving like children, in the pandemic trying to score points as to who was taking it more seriously when people were actually dying. And they may seem to be at each other's throats, but actually there's a lot that puts them in common. You know, they're part of the problem, they're holding Scotland back. We need a reset of not just devolution, but the entirety of politics.
And just like acting in common, we've obviously have the Michael Matheson scandal when £11,000 of public money was misused. We've had scandal after scandal after scandal from the Conservative Party at Westminster. Isn't a key part of this election campaign also about rebuilding trust and restoring integrity, decency and honesty back into our politics, so we have politicians who are in it for the people and a government that's on the people's side, realising it's about them and not their own party interest.
This is why Lib Dems want to introduce an Accountability Act so that the Scottish people can recall their members of the Scottish Parliament from Holyrood, as is available to them for their Westminster MPs as well. We want to go further. We want proportional representation to make every vote count so that people have to work for their votes. We also want to reform the House of Lords and end government by secrecy and WhatsApp.
OK. John Swinney, your turn to question Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Thanks very much, Colin. Alex, do you agree with me that membership of the European Union was good for Scotland?
I do. But John, I'll take no lessons about European membership from you. Your party spent more money losing the Shetland by-election to the Liberal Democrats than it spent on the whole of the 2016 Remain campaign. You're latent converts to that, because what matters to you is not EU membership, it's independence. If you thought that EU membership was going to get in the way of independence, you'd throw it under the bus and Remainers with it. Nobody will listen to you on that.
Well, wait a second, Alex. If I take you back to the referendum campaign in Scotland, and your Secretary of State at the time, Alistair Carmichael, said that people should vote no in that referendum to protect their EU membership, and now we're out of the EU membership. So how on earth can we take the Liberal Democrats seriously on this question of EU membership? Everybody
watching this programme will know that throughout Brexit, throughout the negotiations around Brexit, Liberal Democrats fought tooth and nail to stop it. We bet the farm on it. We are Newcasters, we bleed European, and we are passionate about that.
Let's then, OK, so you're passionate about EU membership. Will the Liberal Democrats be committed in the next parliamentary term to returning the United Kingdom to EU membership?
Nobody can promise that, John. You can't promise that. You
could say that's what...
John, you said at the start of this programme you didn't want to shout match.
I'm not shouting at you. I'm just saying to you, you're telling me that you're passionately pro-European, but you're not going to make the case for rejoining the European Union. Why is that?
There will be an election in the future where our membership of the EU is on the ballot, and the Lib Dems will be in the vanguard of that. But because of what's happened with the Conservative Party in terms of their damaging, reckless behaviour around the trusted relationships we had with Europe, then that is far, far removed. But we're dedicated to building a pathway back to the heart of Europe. Now, your government could have done that. You could have started doing that with Erasmus. We did that in Wales with a Liberal Democrat minister. You did nothing to give kids the opportunity to visit and travel and study in Europe, which you could have done. It was a sitter. Another thing we learned yesterday, so important are the benefits of EU membership to your party. Your government has just handed back £450 million of EU money.
I think you should be kind of cautious about that particular line of argument, Alex, to be honest, because I don't think that's substantiated. But given the degree of damage that's now been done, given the degree of damage that's been done to businesses and the economy of Scotland, why are you not making the urgent case for us to rejoin the European Union and be straight with the public about the damage that Brexit is doing to the public in Scotland?
No, we will be straight with the public, and nobody believes that we could get back into the EU in this next parliamentary term. We believe in real politics and real solutions and real steps to forging those important... Let me finish, John. To forging those vital relationships with Europe that we really miss. And Lib Dems are at the heart of that. It's about removing the friction on the free movement of people, goods, capital and services. There are too many blocks that stop products coming into this, stop businesses getting the workforce that they need.
Without taking that stance to get us back into the European Union,
but you can't make that guarantee
you're baking in the injustice and the damage of Brexit to the Scottish economy.
So
why are you letting people in Scotland down by accepting Brexit?
We are unpicking, seam by seam, the hardest aspects of this hard Tory Brexit that we fought so hard against. Any fair-minded person will know our credentials on the European Union. We are passionately pro-European. We will forge that strong path back to the heart of Europe, brick by brick if we have to. But it's not real to tell people they can get in this parliamentary term, John.
OK. Douglas Ross.
Thanks, Colin. Earlier today, Alex, the Liberal Democrats announced a policy for marine protected areas, which was very similar to the policy the SNP tried to introduce, but they had to U-turn on because there was a furious backlash, understandably, from fishermen and coastal communities. So why are the Lib Dems introducing a similar policy that will have a similar impact on Scottish fishermen here?
Because the UK policy has actually learned from the mistakes of the widespread and hated marine, hyper-protected areas that were highly protected protected areas that were suggested under the Green and SNP administration. We recognise that coastal communities, you won't find somebody more dedicated to conservation of our fish stocks than our fishermen and our fishing communities. And we've learned from them. Every page of our manifesto, and you'll see the details of this fleshed out in our manifesto, fully costed manifesto, I should say, when it's brought out next week, has been developed in step with those fishing communities and will be about long-term sustainability with the interests of the industry at its very heart.
So you saying this won't affect fishing communities here in Scotland?
Not in anything like in the way.
But it will affect.
It was going to.
It will have an impact.
Well, look, I'll let the manifesto speak for itself, and you can see page by page how we've walked.
The policy was announced today, so you'll be able to tell fishermen watching this and the coastal communities who were rightly appalled when John Swinney and his party supported the HPMA. Now, this is marine protected areas.
Fisheries
Can you tell us if that won't have an impact on Scottish fishermen?
Well, I mean, if the Scottish Government chose to follow suit in the same way, because fishing is devolved, then we wouldn't need to do that.
Yeah, but you know, this is plans relate to territorial waters. That's the inshore fisheries in Scotland. That will have an impact.
Well, as you say, as I said, when our manifesto comes out, I'm not going to. I know you're very excited about this, Douglas, but you're very excited about the detail of our issues around fishing. We can talk about that.
Well, that's what I'm trying to do
on the day. I'm not going to reveal that today, but
you've announced the policy today.
And you know, Douglas, that my MSPs, particularly Liam MacArthur, Beatrice Wishart, who represent the Northern Isles, were at the very heart of the campaign to see sense around HPMAs in Scotland. They've been at the heart of the development of this policy. So it's a rational policy as well. Well, look, it's a Liberal Democrat manifesto, so of course Liberal Democrats are behind it. But you're trying to compare apples with pears.
No, I'm just asking, will it have an impact on Scottish fishermen and fishing communities, coastal communities?
Douglas, we will move forward in a process of consultation with the coastal communities of Scotland. I mean,
but we know how worried they were when the HPMAs were proposed, and the SNP had to U-turn on that. But now similar proposals are being suggested by the UK Liberal Democrats.
Because policy after policy of the Green SNP administration was built with ideology first and evidence second. We saw that with the deposit return. Let me finish, Douglas.
Where's the evidence? Well, let's stick to fishermen, please.
Well, let me just finish my point here.
Won't affect Scottish fishermen.
Because this has been built in development with the coastal communities. It's been
the policy
and scientists. Absolutely. Look, you're trying to eke it out of me, Douglas.
Coastal
if you want to use all
agree
your time
with
on
this.
Well, look, we've been working in step.
It's the same.
We've got farming commissions, we've got fishing commissions that inform our party policy. It's not ideologically driven like was happening with the Greens and the SNP.
I think fishermen watching tonight will be worried that you don't have the details around this proposal and will be worried about the implications for them. And up and down the country, Scottish Conservatives will be standing up for them.
This is what's wrong with the politics in this country.
Liberal Democrats
is that
are going to turn their back on them.
Your dog whistle approach, your fear-mongering approach, leads people up a garden path when actually they will see when the manifesto is revealed that we're going to be walking in step with them all the way.
Thank you very much. We're going to take a short break now. Coming up, Douglas Ross and John Swinney will both be facing cross-examination. Be right back. Welcome back to this STV general election Scottish leaders debate. Next up to face cross-examination is the leader of the Scottish Conservatives, Douglas Ross, taking questions first of all from Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Douglas, while women had to give birth alone and people said goodbye to loved ones in intensive care via Zoom, Boris Johnson partied in Downing Street and you defended him. When Liz Truss detonated our economy and sent mortgages skyrocketing, you championed her and said we should have some of that up here as well. Time after time, you have urged the circus on. You have excused the inexcusable. Can I ask you, which one of those decisions to defend some of the worst prime ministers in British history do you regret the most?
Well, I didn't defend Boris Johnson over Partygate. I resigned from his government over it. I couldn't remain a part of the government.
You did submit a letter of no confidence and then withdrew it.
Well, if you let me answer the question, that's what we're trying to do here. I couldn't support that. I could see...
You
Alex
clearly manifested that you did have confidence in him.
We'll try and... Because you are raising a serious issue, and I know the impact of the COVID pandemic affected people hugely at the time and is still affecting them now. And we saw that during the inquiry, the UK government's inquiry, and what that brought to the fore again. And there were absolutely failures there that I have never and will never support, because too many people lost far too much. Each and every one of us in this panel knows someone affected, someone who lost their life, someone grieving a loved one because of what happened there. And the actions within government at the time what you've articulated, it was not acceptable,
understand
and I did not try to defend that.
But
as
you
I say, I
did
resigned
show
from the government.
confidence in him. You withdrew. You put a letter into the 22 committee, and then you withdrew it. And people will rightly ask about your judgment for that. What do you say to them?
So judgment on that, I can understand. I think it's a legitimate question. I put in my letter to the 1922 saying I didn't have confidence in Boris Johnson, and I continued with that until I woke up on a Thursday morning and the news I heard was that Ukraine had been invaded by Russia, that we had war in Europe for the first time in my lifetime, something I never thought I would have to experience and go through, and see people going into battle elsewhere in Europe, and I felt it was right at the time that we had stability and we had a government here in the UK that was working with partners across Europe.
People might have doubted that we had the right leader at the time.
And around the world as well.
Question?
Just on that, I think it was important that we, as the West, showed a united front to help and support those in Ukraine against the aggression that we saw from Vladimir Putin that is still going on today.
You won't get any argument from me on Ukraine. I am sanctioned by the Kremlin because of the work we've done on that.
Yep.
Since the campaign began, you and John Swinney almost every day have talked about independence. Have you noticed that you're the only ones talking about independence? People have moved on. They want to know why their hip replacement's coming, why they can't see their local GP. When are you guys going to realise that it's actually you two that are holding Scotland back?
Well, we can go to VAR and check, but I think you mentioned independence earlier to John Swinney. But, you know, I'm mentioning it because it is an issue that people can see the focus of the Scottish Government is on independence.
But it's your only issue.
It has been. No, it's not. No, I'm very happy to speak about. Well, I am.
Mental health or long COVID.
Absolutely, I'm speaking about those things. I want to see our waiting times in Scotland reduced. 1 in 7 Scots on a waiting list here in Scotland.
Well, let's hear more about that.
We
don't want to fight the battles of the past.
No, you're right.
Been holding us back
and I think
for
this is
so
something
long.
we can agree on, Alex. You know, for example, on GPs, we want to make it easier for people to see GPs. It's too difficult at the moment because we don't have enough GPs. That's a Scottish Conservative policy to recruit more GPs.
OK, you can always trust the link to bring up VAR. Anas Sarwar.
Douglas, you should be pleading for votes. You should be begging for forgiveness from the Scottish people. Mortgages up £2,000 a year, supermarket prices through the roof, and energy prices have soared. So rather than asking for people's votes, shouldn't you be touring the country, apologising for the Tory party damage to this country over the last 14 years?
I don't think anyone is trying to downplay, and you will not hear me at all tonight or at any point in this campaign downplaying the difficult circumstances that are facing people here in Scotland, across the whole of the UK, and indeed in many other parts of the world. Because we have a global cost of living crisis. We have seen, as I just discussed with Alex Cole-Hamilton, the issues around energy prices that spiked after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And of course, we had the COVID pandemic that we've all lived through. But governments, again, across the globe, had to take really difficult decisions to support people. So, for example, we had the furlough scheme here in the United Kingdom that protected so many jobs here in Scotland and across the UK. We had support for businesses here in Scotland and across the UK. All of these things have to be paid for by the government. I think they were absolutely the right thing to do. And I also think, Anas, because I think this is a moment of consensus, these were things that all the parties agreed. We had to support people during that COVID pandemic. And that has had an impact on our economy, as have other things, such as the war in Ukraine and the global cost of living crisis.
But you're not accepting the decisions made by your government.
I am. I said that at the very beginning.
You're actually campaigning for 5 more years of this Tory government. So I want to ask you what achievement over the last 5 years you're most proud of. Are you most proud of Boris Johnson partying while people were locked away from their families? Are you most proud of Rishi Sunak giving billions of pounds of PPE contracts to his pals? Are you most proud of Liz Truss's mini-budget that crashed the economy? Or are you most proud of Suella Braverman inciting a riot at the Cenotaph? What are you most proud of?
I'm proud of how this country came together in some of the most difficult periods.
Parties during lockdown?
You're asking about the last 5 years. I've just discussed that with Alex Cole-Hamilton. You will not find me defending those parties. Like
are you
everyone
defending
else,
the COVID money to your pals?
Like everyone else.
Are you defending the COVID money?
Like everyone else. I followed the rules to the letter
of
the law.
Are you defending the COVID contracts to Tory party donors?
No, but you're asking about the last 5 years. And
I'm asking about COVID contracts. Are you defending the billions of pounds wasted?
No.
Are you defending Liz Truss's mini-budget that put mortgages up?
Just on this, Anas, you've got to ask a question and then allow me to at least answer. I know you weren't so keen to do it yourself. This is an issue that rightly affects people, that people are still living with the impacts of the COVID pandemic, with the decisions taken by governments in Scotland and the UK.
Are you defending Liz Truss?
Decisions around the world.
So you're not defending Liz Truss?
No, I'm saying
you're not defending Liz Truss.
Really...
Are you defending Suella Braverman, who incited that riot at the Cenotaph?
No, I am not.
OK, so that's all four you're not defending.
No,
so,
Anas,
so
I think
do you
it's
accept this election
Anas,
is about change, it's about getting rid of the Tories, and that Scotland can't afford 5 more years of a Tory party government, and they can't afford to miss this opportunity of electing a Labour government, the only party that can replace the Conservatives across the UK?
What I would say is people listen to you saying change a lot and don't get any of the detail behind it. We heard you dismissing...
Change from corruption.
No,
change
it's
from
change for the North East of Scotland.
Change from incompetence.
That means jobs lost in the North Sea. It means change that doesn't help us in our just transition from oil and gas to renewables. But also, it's important that in key seats up and down the country, people can see it's going to be a straight choice between the Scottish Conservatives and the SNP. That's what we saw in the poll today. And if people want to beat the SNP, they can unite behind the Scottish Conservatives.
That's what we come on to now. John Swinney, you have 3.5 minutes.
Douglas, the Liz Truss budget crashed the economy. It led to soaring increases in people's mortgage rates, and it has led to reductions in public expenditure. You demanded that I follow and echo those plans in Scotland. Do you regret that?
I looked at that budget and I assumed, like every budget you delivered in the Scottish Parliament and every budget I've sat through at Westminster, that they had gone through the normal process with the Treasury, with the civil servants, to make sure that they were enforceable, that the work had been done behind the scenes to make sure what had been announced was deliverable. And that hadn't been done. And I hold my hands up. I assumed that had been done. I assume the work that goes on to make sure budgets are ready on the day they're delivered, be they the budgets you've delivered in Holyrood or the budgets the Chancellor of the Exchequer delivers at Westminster. That hadn't been done, and to answer your question, John, that has had an impact. That has had an impact on household incomes, it's had an impact, but what we're also seeing is the UK government now taking decisions to improve the economy. We've seen that. We've seen that with the reduction. With respect, if I can just answer this point, because we have seen from the UK government action to reduce inflation. We've seen it go from over 11% to 2.3%, and the biggest thing we've seen from the UK government recently is putting more money into people's pockets, because we've seen cuts to national insurance that ensures people here in Scotland and across the UK have more money in their pockets, unlike budgets to the SNP that put taxes up.
But Douglas, let's just focus on the Liz Truss budget, because all of the things that you said there that were a surprise to you later on were, you've just said that, Douglas, you thought it was all that preparatory work had been done.
I'm saying that's the normal process, which you will know as a former finance secretary.
I'm very conversant with that, but it was all obvious on the day, Douglas.
No, actually, if you remember, John, you were going to go away and look at the figures.
Douglas, don't interrupt me. All these issues were available and obvious on the day, and you demanded that I follow suit. And if I'd done that, I would have undermined the Scottish economy and people's livelihoods and people's household income.
But surely you accept, John, you said you weren't going to talk over people.
He's just coming at a question.
Will you now apologise for another appalling error of judgment on your part?
I have accepted, and I accept mistakes were made. Will you accept that bringing the Greens into government, which was one of your key achievements as Deputy First Minister, and ensuring that Scotland now is the highest tax part of the United Kingdom, is a mistake, and that has an impact on people watching tonight and voters across Scotland? Scotland being the highest tax part of the United Kingdom.
What I won't apologise for, Douglas, is the fact that we've got an extra investment in the National Health Service, because we're being shortchanged of investment in the National Health Service
record-long waits on the NHS.
Because of the austerity. But Douglas, the austerity that your government has presided over has inflicted significant harm on the public finances and services of Scotland. And what we're doing is investing to overcome that. So we've taken the hard decisions to invest in the National Health Service to pick up the damage that your government has done.
You brought the Greens into government, who were anti-economic growth, whose policies were very divisive, and that has led to Scotland being the highest tax part of the United Kingdom and people getting less for paying more in Scotland. That's not an achievement to be proud of.
OK, we're just about to reverse this, because the final politician to be grilled this evening is the SNP leader, John Swinney. And first up is Douglas Ross.
Thanks, Colin. John Swinney, independence is line 1 of your manifesto. What's line 2?
Line 2 will be about ensuring that we focus on The issues that are at stake in this election, which are about the impact of austerity, Brexit and the cost of living crisis, every one of those, every single one of them is a product of decision-making made by the Conservative government at Westminster, which has inflicted significant damage on Scotland and the Scottish economy.
So why do they all rank below independence in your priorities?
Because independence is the solution to the austerity, the Brexit and the cost of living crisis that the folly of your government has inflicted on Scotland.
So for John Swinney and the SNP, independence trumps everything else?
For John Swinney and the SNP, independence is the solution to the challenges that are faced by austerity, Brexit and the cost of living crisis, all of which have been delivered by a useless and incompetent Conservative government.
Humza Yousaf, Nicola Sturgeon, Alex Salmond all prioritised independence above everything else. You've confirmed tonight that's your strategy. Are you any different from your predecessors?
Well, I'm John Swinney. I stand on my own record and the achievements that I've got under my belt.
So what did they do wrong that you would now correct?
Well, what I would say, Douglas, is that what unites me with my predecessors is that all of us recognise the folly of decision-making at Westminster, and your government has really excelled itself in that folly because it's delivered that trio of austerity, Brexit and the cost of living crisis. Now, I see independence as the solution to those issues and the damage that's been done to Scotland as a consequence.
So some people might say the thing that unites you with your predecessors is scandal. You were at the heart of the ferry scandal. What would you do to improve the situation with Highland communities who can't get the ferries they were promised because they're delayed and over budget? What about education? You were the Deputy First Minister and Education Secretary that saw Scotland's education standards plummet down international rankings. And what about Michael Matheson? Why are you still defending a liar?
Well, let's go through each of these.
Please.
So on ferries, there'll be 6 new ferries will come into the Scottish fleet in the course of the next 2 years as a consequence of the decisions
ferries
that...
are late and over budget.
Well, Douglas, there'll be 6 new ferries coming into the ferry fleet. Surely you've got enough generosity of spirit to welcome the fact that more ferries will be coming into the ferry fleet.
Let's move on to education. What about the young people you let down?
Well, what we're seeing now is we're seeing record levels of attainment on numeracy and literacy within primary schools in Scotland. And last year, young people in Scotland delivered the highest level of National 5 passes of any year in history. So that's a significant achievement by the young people and the education system of Scotland.
And Michael Matheson, why are you still backing a liar?
Well, Michael Matheson made mistakes and Parliament has decided the penalty that Michael Matheson has got to face, and I accept that penalty has got to be put in place. So Michael's had to face up to these difficulties. He made mistakes, and Parliament's taken its decisions.
How can you move Scotland forward when you've been at the centre of every scandal the SNP's been involved in for the last 17 years?
Well, what the SNP has delivered is higher economic performance in Scotland. We've delivered investment in our public infrastructure. We've delivered improvements in our public services, and I'll build on that record as First Minister.
OK. Alex Cole-Hamilton.
John, when COVID-19 reached our shores, you were Deputy First Minister. In those key early days, your government took the decision to move untested and even COVID-positive patients from our hospitals into our care homes, costing tens of thousands of lives. We know now that the assurance that Nicola Sturgeon made to Channel 4 News that she would retain all of the messages, not just her, but her top team, for the inquiry they knew was sure to follow, was a lie. That actually every night they were going back and deleting all those messages. Those messages were key to the culture and calculation behind those decisions and may forever deprive the COVID-bereaved families of this country the answers they seek. Can you understand why families who used to trust you now feel so utterly betrayed?
I understand the deep sensitivity that everybody feels about the COVID pandemic, and we all lived through that, and as a government minister, I lived through the difficulties and the challenges every day of trying to take the right decisions, particularly where information was developing and emerging about the threat that we were facing, because in 2022 we had a very different impression of COVID than we had in March 2020.
Did you ever delete any messages?
Well, I've set out my position to the COVID inquiry that I followed the Scottish Government's information retention policy at all times, because the Government's information policy says that everything that is relevant to the handling of the pandemic
how do you know what's
should
relevant?
be...
That's for an inquiry to decide.
Well, there's an obligation on everybody to make sure that information is placed on the government's official record. I followed that to the letter. And all those issues were explained to the COVID inquiry.
We can never know that, John. We can never know that because if you've deleted it, we can't know it. It's not there anymore. And it's not there for the families at the heart of this who are looking for answers. And isn't that... John, what's rotten about your party right now? It's the constant back covering, the covering of your tracks, protecting your mates, and nobody ever really takes responsibility for these big scandals, and they are. And that, I would say, aside from all the things that Douglas has talked about, the deletion of COVID WhatsApp material, which denies those families answers, is the biggest scandal of devolution. I want to move on to, I think, what is perhaps the biggest failing of your government, and that is that while the pandemic is in large part over, there are many, many thousands of young people in this country who are still toiling and living under the long shadow of lockdown. Many of them are in a state of mental crisis, but if they come forward, they join the longest queue in the National Health Service. We've talked about this over many years. Liberal Democrats have fought your government tooth and nail to take this seriously, but it is the longest queue in the National Health Service. Can you tell me, what is the strategy? Why do you recognise how badly you've let these young people down? And talk is cheap, because you've told us that you'll fix it before, but where's the plan? Well, and why have you cut tens of millions of pounds out of the budget along the way?
Well, the government is putting in place record expenditure in the National Health...
You've cut back expenditure on mental health.
I'm very, very happy to answer the questions. So the government is putting in record funding into the National Health Service. Indeed, Douglas Ross has just been pressing me about tax changes that we've made to enable us to invest more in the National Health Service. So we're investing to ensure that the healthcare services are in place to meet the needs and the expectations of people in our country, and that includes young people battling with the challenges of mental health services.
You've cut the money.
No. Anas Sarwar, it's your turn.
John, you lead a party mired in sleaze and scandal. As Education Secretary, you downgraded the grades of working-class kids during the pandemic. As Finance Secretary, you brutally cut local budgets and local services. And on the SNP's watch, 1 in 6 Scots are stuck on an NHS waiting list because of your incompetence. Now, I'm absolutely clear we need change in Scotland and the Scottish Parliament too, and it's no secret that I'll be working really hard in the run-up to 2026 to deliver that change. But this election is about getting rid of this Tory government, and it can only be replaced by a Labour government with Scottish Labour MPs at its heart, delivering for the Scottish people. So surely you agree getting rid of this rotten Tory government is an opportunity Scotland can't afford to miss. Well,
I absolutely agree that we should get rid of the Tory government, but I think what's clear is that not a single seat needs to change hands in Scotland other than the 6 where the SNP is the challenger to the Tories to enable a Labour government. Look at the polls tonight. You know, you're walking away with this...
You just said not a single vote's been cast.
But you're walking away with the election based on the results in England that are coming out of opinion polls. And the challengers to the 6 Tory MPs in Scotland are the Scottish National Party. So people in Scotland, if they want to get rid of the Tory government, can vote SNP to right across the country, and by so doing, they will get rid of the 6 Tory MPs that are in place, and they'll elect a strong group of SNP MPs who put Scotland's interests first.
Well, let me just come back on that. You can get rid of 6 Tory MPs. Labour can get rid of an entire Tory government. And in 2017 and 2019, you said, don't vote Labour because they can't win this election. Now in 2024, you're saying don't vote Labour because they can't lose this election. But isn't it the case that we can't take the risk? We can't afford another 5 years of this rotten Tory government, and the only way to make sure we get rid of the Tories is by electing a Labour government, and in 4 weeks they could be gone if people choose Labour in this election.
This is very unlike you to demonstrate such a lack of self-confidence. Normally you're very self-confident about the Labour Party. The Labour Party is going to walk it in England. The Tories are finished. But Scotland's got an opportunity to make sure that Scotland's interests are protected at Westminster. And that only comes by electing SNP MPs right across the country who can speak up for Scotland, defend the interests of Scotland, because what I'm worried about is that a Labour government's going to come in and Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves are setting all this out, that they are going to maintain the same fiscal stranglehold on the public finances, and that's disastrous for our public services.
I've already demonstrated how you're wrong about those areas. But let me talk about change, because this election is about change, and people are crying out for change. And with a Labour government, 200,000 Scots getting a pay rise, billions of investment in our energy potential squandered by your government, more money for the NHS to cut waiting lists, economic stability to lower the cost of people's mortgages, £2,000 higher under the Tories, and maximising Scotland's influence by selling more of our great produce abroad and creating more jobs here. Can't you see that's the change Scotland needs? And we can only do that if we get rid of this rotten Tory government.
You might change the government, but you're going to keep austerity, Anas, and that is not what Scotland needs.
Not true.
Thank you all. That was actually pretty civilised compared to other leaders' debates that I've seen. But that's the end of our cross-examinations. So the leaders have faced each other, but that's nothing compared to facing you, the voters, on July the 4th. Just to round off this debate, let's have some final brief words from each of the leaders. Douglas Ross first.
In key seats across Scotland, it's going to be extremely tight between the Scottish Conservatives and the SNP. So if voters unite behind the Scottish Conservatives, we can beat the SNP, end their obsession with independence for good, and get the focus onto your priorities.
Anas Sarwar.
It's time for change. In 4 weeks, we can get rid of this Tory government, and it's an opportunity Scotland cannot afford to miss. So every vote for Scottish Labour is a vote to make sure we get rid of this Tory government, to maximise Scotland's influence, and to deliver the change that Scotland needs.
John Swinney.
Westminster has delivered austerity, Brexit and the cost of living crisis, which is damaging the lives and the livelihoods of every household in this country. Scotland deserves much better than that. I ask you to vote SNP on July the 4th to make sure that we can put forward Scotland's interests and protect Scotland at Westminster.
Alex Cole-Hamilton.
We've heard tonight from two parties who've been in power for far too long, taking you for granted and breaking rules. Elect a Scottish Liberal Democrat and they will work their hearts out for you and focus on what really matters. Hope and change are just around the corner. You only need to vote for it. Back the Scottish Liberal Democrats for a better Britain and a fairer Scotland.
Well, thanks to the leaders for taking part tonight, for some post-match analysis, possibly some VAR, who knows. It's over to Rona and our guests. From all of us here in the debate studio, though, goodbye.
Thanks, Colin. Yes, our guests are poised to pass their verdicts on what we've just seen. But first, time for a short break. We'll be back in just a few minutes. Welcome back. Well, watching the leaders' debate with me were the community editor and columnist with The National, Shona Craven, the political editor of ITV Border, Peter McMahon, and Lucy Dunn, who writes on Scottish and UK politics for The Spectator. Well, Colin was right. That really did fly past. It was absolutely fascinating. Let's start with how you thought the leaders all performed, Shona. They were pretty well behaved, weren't they?
They were quite well behaved. I thought Anas Sarwar was very confident, all the confidence of someone who can make a lot of promises without showing us any of the maths and the sums. John Swinney introducing a degree of responsibility and scrutiny of those policies, some realism from someone who's a former finance secretary. Douglas Ross, fairly opportunistic, said he was going to talk about what the people wanted to talk about, but seemed really keen to talk about issues affecting marginal seats that he's trying to defend in the North East. Alex Cole-Hamilton really enjoying getting into the cross-examination, obviously done a lot of practising in the mirror of all these questions he was going to ask of John Swinney and Douglas Ross. Yeah, well, of course, Anas Sarwar would have been confident coming in, having seen that YouGov poll today, but what did you think of them?
Well, he would, Peter? And he is obviously a confident performer, but I think why this was so effective was that there were specific areas that all of the leaders were uncomfortable, particularly when it came to the questioning from their fellow party leaders. I thought Anas Sarwar was uncomfortable on spending and what would Labour do. Maybe we need VAR to see what exactly...
I was just going, you stole my line, because we didn't quite catch what he said, did we?
There was a bit of interchange, but certainly he was uncomfortable on spending and the charge that you're just like the Tories. John Swinney looked a bit uncomfortable on this idea of oil licensing. There have been some reports that the SNP is going to soften their line on that, with an eye to the North East of Scotland in particular. Alex Cole-Hamilton was very uncomfortable on his party's previous massive support for EU and not wanting to rejoin immediately. And Douglas Ross, obviously on the Johnson and Truss governments, to the point where he basically said, I supported Liz Truss's budget, and then I found out they didn't do the sums.
Yeah, based on an assumption.
That's essentially what he said, which, of course, as we now know is true. But that's what he said.
Yeah. Lucy, what did you think of how they all performed?
Well, I think what's interesting is Anas Sarwar very much was going on about the change rhetoric that we've seen from Keir Starmer and across the country. That's what Labour's pushing. I think what's very interesting, though, is actually when you do speak to voters, is that there is not really a pull factor towards Labour. It's very much sort of pushing themselves away from other parties like the SNP and the Conservatives. And I think Douglas Ross actually did make quite a good point in which he said Labour talk about change a lot but don't really have much detail behind it. I think part of this does come down to what we were just talking about, is that in actual fact Labour themselves are still worrying about how they're going to find money, how they're going to raise funds, and they don't want to overpromise, but because they don't want to overpromise, there's not really that attractive vision here quite yet.
Yeah, and we will get more detail at some point.
Well, I think it is worth saying that the Institute for Fiscal Studies report was mentioned. Now, say that some people and their kind of eyes glaze over, but these are the people that crunch the numbers. And they said that the public finances loom like, I quote, a dark cloud over whoever becomes the next government. Massive debt, possibly having to raise taxes or possibly having to cut spending. And that will have consequences if money comes or doesn't come to Scotland. And all of the party leaders, not sure any of them really faced up to that properly.
Yeah, and this is when John Swinney accused of Anas Sarwar of rewriting Labour's economic policy. That's when we wanted VAR, because we didn't quite hear what he said about the spending.
Well, I think
the borrowing.
I think Sarwar was maybe trying to sort of drown out that question a little bit. But yeah, he was all spend, spend, spend. But as we know, Rachel Reeves is all restraint, restraint, restraint. And so this highlights the fact that Anas Sarwar, he is a branch manager of Scottish Labour. It is the UK party that sets the agenda. He can talk a good game. He can use the word change. I think I counted about a dozen times. But when you actually drill down to it, there is that black hole. And John Swinney knows the numbers and was asking him and pushing him on that. And he didn't have the answer. It sounded good if you were just listening casually and thinking, oh, yeah, we want some change. But John Swinney was really bringing some realism to that and highlighting the fact that Sarwar can make these promises, but Rachel Reeves, as Lucy says, is not making big promises. And there is this silent acknowledgement that there will have to be cuts somewhere. So where?
Yeah, and there was a lot to talk about the oil licences at the top, and Douglas Ross was very keen to talk about that, wasn't he? And pushing the SNP and what they were going to do about the oil licences.
Absolutely, and we've talked about the message with the SNP not being quite clear as of yet whether they are changing their stance on oil and gas licences in the North Sea. It's something that the Scottish Tories will be very keen to talk about, partly because the key battlegrounds between the SNP and the Scottish Tories are across essentially the north and northeast of Scotland. Obviously, there's an area on the borders too that some of the Scottish Tories are quite keen to focus on. But I think essentially what's difficult for the SNP here is that they're fighting a number of different election campaigns actually. In the Central Belt, they're trying to fend off Labour across seats in Glasgow and Edinburgh and around that kind of area. And that's a very different type of argument and campaign message they'll need to put across, as opposed to places further north, for example, in Murray and Aberdeenshire. And I think as a result of that, we're going to see the SNP struggle a little bit to try and finesse their messaging, given that they actually are really, in many ways, fending off a number of competitors.
Yeah,
I mean, John Swinney said Labour is going to walk it. We're asking for VAR on that one, actually. As to when he actually said vote it in England, or walk it in England, but certainly he used the words walk it. So that exposes one of the key issues that voters will have to decide.
Yeah.
If you want to get rid of the Tories, do you, as Anas Sarwar says, vote Labour to bring in a government, or do you, as John Swinney says, vote for the SNP to send a very strong, in his words, pro-Scottish message to the Westminster Parliament?
Yeah.
On that note, though, as well, what's very interesting is when you do speak to voters, as much as people are still, there's a lot of people that are very pro-independence, and we've seen the polls that say, you know, it's around about 50%, up and down, it does fluctuate. But that's not really what's on voters' minds at this election. This is not an election that's going to be based on the Constitution, even in Scotland. And while we have seen John Swinney talk about other issues, for example, eradication of child poverty, growing the economy, this is stuff that we heard Kate Forbes talk about last year during her leadership bid, there's still that line one, page one of the manifesto that's going to be dedicated towards independence. And how much of that is really just in many ways there to keep the core vote in is a very interesting angle too.
Yeah, what do you think about that, Sian?
Well, I think you've got to ask, when you have a Westminster government, are people going to be just assuming that their budget is going to work out well and that's going to increase spending in health? So many people talked about about health, a devolved issue in Scotland, but that depends on competent management of the UK at Westminster. And if we in Scotland can't trust that because the agenda of English voters is so different from ours, how can we be sure that we will get more money?
So is this YouGov poll today that says Labour's going to get this huge lead almost make it difficult for Anas Sarwar? Because then you've got all these seats in England, you don't need them in Scotland.
That's the argument that they're
playing it down.
That's the argument that Labour's opponents. That's the argument Labour's opponents are going to make to them. I mean, the counter-argument they make is that Scotland's important. Keir Starmer says the road to Downing Street lies in Scotland. But that's, as I was saying, that's the argument. And voters, if their prime motivation is getting rid of the Tories, they will have to make a decision in the central belt. Although in the North East, as we were saying, it's more between the SNP and...
Sorry, that might be Keir Starmer's argument, but if you look back historically, it's not true. It won't matter what happens in Scotland. I think we can see from these polls, it's not going to make the difference. We're not going to clinch it. And so if you want a voice for Scotland, it has to be an SNP voice.
I just want to touch on a bit Labour Lib Dems having a bit of a love in there, weren't they?
It was interesting.
It was gentle.
It didn't seem quite as fiery as maybe the other cross-examination questions were. Absolutely, and I think what's quite interesting there is perhaps maybe not sort of much relevant for the 2024 election, but we do have a Scottish election in 2 years' time, and you do wonder if there's maybe some relationships being formed there. But I think certainly, going back to Shona's point as well about Labour and the SNP in Scotland, I think as much as, again, this is not about a Holyrood government, what is interesting is when you speak to people, there's a certain amount of almost a protest vote in some ways in voting for Labour because they're fed up of the SNP. And the SNP has been in power in Holyrood for 17 years, facing very similar problems to the Tories who've been in Westminster for over a decade. And people are getting fed up. They're not seeing their lives change. And as I was saying before, there's no real pull factor from Labour, but there is this real frustration, and actually a lot of that we might see turn into voter apathy as well.
Well, we'll have to leave it there, but thank you all so much for your input. It was absolutely fascinating. I do love a good debate. Thank you very much indeed. And that brings us to the end of our special programme. And if you want to watch it all over again, and why wouldn't you, you can catch up. There are, of course, a number of parties contesting this general election. I'll be back here on Wednesday with Scotland Tonight, when among our guests will be the co-leader of the Scottish Greens, Patrick Harvie. And we'll also hear from Alba. And for viewers in ITV Border, Peter McMahon will be talking to the Scottish Greens and Alba too on representing Border. That's also on Wednesday night. Well, thank you very much indeed for watching. From all of us here, good night.